Hello, and welcome to Iowa Stage Theater Company's SCRIPTEASE audio drama and our current project, twice-monthly presentations from the newly published work, Love for Short, by R. Andrew White, Iowa Stage Theater resident artist company member James Serpento, and with Jane Martsinovsky Hendricks. Love for Short is a new collection of translations and adaptations of short works of Anton Chekhov on the subject of love. Tonight, we present two pieces, A Story Without an End and Zina. A Story Without an End is a short story about dealing with death, while Zina takes us through the terrible moment to be with that death. First up, written in 1886, Anton Chekhov's A Story Without an End, translated by R. Andrew White and performed by Iowa Stage Theater Company resident company member James Serpento.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, long ago, the cook, pallid and worried, suddenly ran into my study and announced that Melutina, the old woman who owned the tiny neighboring house, was sitting in her kitchen. "She begs you, sir, to go to her," said the cook, short of breath. "Something bad has happened to her tenant. He shot himself or hanged himself." "What can I do?" I said. "Have her go to a doctor or the police." "Where can she find a doctor? She can hardly breathe from fear and is hiding under the stove. You should go to her, sir." I got dressed and went to Melutina's. The gate toward which I headed was open. After standing near it in uncertainty and without reaching for the porter's doorbell, I entered the yard. The porch, dark and in disrepair, was not locked either. I opened it and walked into the entryway. Not a speck of light, total darkness, and what's more, the distinct smell of incense. Feeling my way out of the porch, I hit my elbow on something made of iron, and in the dark tripped over some boards that nearly toppled onto the ground. Finally, I found the door, which was bordered by torn felt, and entered a small vestibule. At present, I am writing no fairy tale, and am far from intending to frighten the reader, but the image that I observed from the entryway was fantastical, and could have been drawn only by death. Just ahead of me was a door leading to a small room. Faded, slate-colored wallpaper was barely illuminated by 3 5-kopeck wax candles. In the middle of the room, on 2 tables, stood a coffin. The votive candles burned only to illuminate a small, dark-complexioned, yellow face with a half-opened mouth and a sharp nose. From the face to the tips of 2 shoes, waves of gauze and muslin mingled in disarray, from which peeked 2 pale, immobile hands holding a wax cross. The dark, gloomy corners of the little room, the icons behind the coffin, everything. Everything except for the quietly flickering candlelight was deathly still, like the grave. What are these wonders, I thought, now stunned by this startling panorama of death? Why such haste? The tenant hasn't even had time to shoot or hang himself, and already a coffin? I looked around. To the left was a door with a glass plate along the top. To the right was a worn-out hall tree with a tattered fur coat. "Give me water," I heard someone groan. The groan came from the left, from behind the door with the glass overhead. I opened the door and entered a small room, dark, with a single window through which timidly shone the faint light from a street lamp. "Is someone here?" I asked. And, not waiting for an answer, I lit a match. As it burned, I saw the following. Right at my feet, on the blood-stained floor, sat a man. Had my stride been longer, I would have stepped on him. Stretching his legs before him and bracing his hands against the floor, he was able to lift his handsome, deathly pale face with a black-as-ink, cloud-like beard. In the big eyes which he raised toward me, I read an inexpressible horror, pain, and despair. On his face flowed large beads of cold sweat. The sweat, the expression on his face, his trembling of the hands with which he propped himself, the ragged breathing and his clenched teeth indicated that he was suffering unbearably. Near his right hand, in a pool of blood, lay a revolver. "Don't leave," I heard a weak voice say when the match went out. "There's a candle on the table." I lit the candle, and not knowing where to begin, stopped in the middle of the room. I stood and looked at the man sitting on the floor, and it seemed to me that I had seen him before. The pain is unbearable, he whispered, and I don't have the strength to shoot myself again. Incomprehensible indecision. I threw off my coat and tended to the sick man. I lifted him from the floor like a child, placed him on the oilcloth-covered sofa, and carefully undressed him. He trembled and was cold when I took off his clothes. The wound I saw wasn't consistent with his tremors or with the expression on his face. It was minor. The bullet had passed between the 5th and 6th ribs on the left side, tearing only the tissue and skin. The bullet itself I found in the lining of the back pocket of his frock coat. Stopping the bleeding as well as I could, I made a temporary bandage out of a pillowcase, a towel, and 2 handkerchiefs. I gave the injured man something to drink and covered him with the fur coat that hung in the entryway. The entire time I bandaged him, we spoke not a word. I worked, and he lay motionless, looking at me through tightly squinting eyes as though he were ashamed of his unsuccessful gunshot and the trouble he caused me. "Now try to lie still," I said, finishing the bandage, "and I'll run to the pharmacy and bring you something." "It's not necessary," he mumbled, grabbing me by the sleeve and opening his eyes as wide as possible. In his eyes I read fear. He was afraid that I would leave. "It's not necessary. Sit here for 5 minutes, 10. If you're not disgusted, sit down, I beg you." He begged and trembled, his teeth chattered. I listened and sat on the sofa's edge. 10 minutes passed in silence. I was quiet, looking around the room into which destiny had carried me so unexpectedly. What poverty! This person, with such a handsome, gentle face and well-groomed full beard, was in a setting that a simple craftsman wouldn't envy. An oilcloth sofa, torn and full of holes, a simple chair soiled with grease stains, and a table covered in a mess of papers, a shabby oleograph on the wall. That was all I saw. Damp, dark, and gray. "Such wind," said the sick man, not opening his eyes. "How it wails." "Yes," I said. "Listen, it seems to me that I know you. Didn't you participate last year in some amateur plays at General Lokachev's dacha?" "So?" he asked, quickly opening his eyes. A cloud swept over his face. "I definitely saw you there. Aren't you Vasiliev?" "If I am, so what? Doesn't make it any easier if you know me." "Well, no, not easier. I just asked you, that's all." Vasiliev closed his eyes and, as though insulted, turned his head to the back of the sofa. "I don't understand this curiosity," he mumbled. "All I need is for you to start asking what led me to commit suicide." Not a minute had passed, and again he turned to me, opened his eyes, and said in a sorrowful voice, "Excuse me for this tone, but you must agree that I'm right. To ask an inmate why he sits in prison, or a suicidal man the reason he shot himself, is inconsiderate and indelicate. To satisfy your curiosity at the expense of someone else's nerves." "You're upset over nothing. I wasn't thinking to ask you about your reasons." "You would have asked. That's the way people are." "And why should you ask?" "I'll tell you. And you either won't understand or you won't believe me. I myself, to be honest, don't understand. There are sensational terms in the newspapers like hopeless love and desperate poverty, but the reasons are unknown. They aren't known to me, nor to you, nor your newspapers, which they have the gall to write from the diary of a suicide. Only God understands the condition of a man's soul when he takes his life. People don't know." "All of this is very well," I said, "but you shouldn't talk so much." But my suicide was not to be deterred. He propped up his head on his fist and continued in the tone of a sickly professor. "A person can never understand the psychological subtleties of suicide. Where is there a reason? Today, the reason forces him to grab a revolver. Tomorrow, that very reason isn't worth a hill of beans. It depends probably on the condition of the person at the particular moment. Take me, for example. Half an hour ago, I passionately wanted to die. Now, with a lighted candle and you sitting near me, I don't contemplate the hour of death. Explain this change. Did I become rich? Or did my wife rise from the dead? Is it the candlelight that affects me, or the presence of a stranger? Light definitely has an effect, I mumbled, just to say something. The effect of light on an organ is the effect of light! We acknowledge, but people shoot themselves even by candlelight. And there would be little honor for the heroes of your novels if something as trivial as a candle could change so sharply the direction of the drama. All of this nonsense! Perhaps it's understandable, but not to us. To ask about and explain what you don't understand is nothing. Pardon me, I said, but judging by the expression on your face, seems to me that at the moment you are showing off. Yes, Vasiliev suddenly remembered. It could very well be. By nature, I'm awfully vain and childish. Well then, explain, if you believe one's facial expression. Half an hour ago, I shot myself, and now I'm showing off. Explain that. The last words Vasiliev spoke in a weak, fading voice. He was tired and fell silent. There was a silence, and I began to study his face. It was pale, like that of a dead man. Life in him, it appeared, was fading, and only the traces of the suffering which this vain and childish man had endured signaled that he was still alive. It was frightening to look at that face, but what was it to be Vasiliev himself, who had strength still to philosophize, and, if I were not mistaken, to show off? "Are you here?" he asked suddenly, propping himself on his elbow. "My God, you must listen closely." I began to listen. On the dark window, without a minute of silence, the rain beat angrily, mournfully, and dismally wailed the wind. "And I shall be whiter than snow. I will hear joy and gladness." In the hall, Milyatina, having returned, was reading in a listless, tired voice, neither raising nor lowering the monotonous, tiresome note. "Isn't it joyful?" whispered Vasiliev, turning his frightened face to me. "My God, what a person must see and hear to set this chaos to music! It would confound the ignorant and amaze indeed, as Hamlet says, the very faculties of eyes and ears. How I would have understood such music then! How I would have felt it! What time is it?" 5 minutes to 3. "It is far from morning, and in the morning is the funeral. A beautiful prospect. You walk behind the coffin in the mud and rain. You walk and you don't see anything except the cloudy sky and the miserable landscape. The muddy torch-bearers, taverns, wood piles, pants soaked to the knees. The long, endless streets, the time stretching out like eternity, the crude people. And on the soul is a stone. A stone." He was silent for a bit, and then suddenly asked, "Has it been long since you've seen General Lukachev?" "I haven't seen him since summer." "He loves to get on his high horse. He's a nice old man. And you still write?" "Yes, a little." "Well, do you remember with what joy, with what ecstasy I jumped at those amateur theatricals when I was courting Zina? It was foolish, but it's good, it's happy. Just the memory of it brings back the smell of spring. But now, what an abrupt change of scene. Here's a subject for you. Only don't get it in your head to write Diary of a Suicide. That's vulgar and cliché. You find something humorous in it." "Again, you're showing off," I said. "There's nothing humorous about your situation." "Nothing humorous? You say there's nothing humorous?" Vasiliev raised himself up slightly, and tears shimmered in his eyes. An expression of bitter disappointment washed over his pale face. His chin trembled. "You laugh at bankers and unfaithful wives," he said, "but not one banker, not one unfaithful wife has cheated as fate has cheated me. I was deceived like no bank depositor, like no betrayed husband has ever been deceived before. Just understand what a laughable idiot I've made of myself. Last year, before your eyes, I was beside myself with happiness, but now, before your eyes..." Vasiliev's head fell onto the pillow, and he laughed. "You can't imagine anything more laughable or stupid than this reversal. First chapter, spring, love, honeymoon. Honey, in fact. Second chapter, search for a job, a loan from the pawn shop, poverty, the pharmacy. And tomorrow's trudge through mud to the cemetery. He laughed again. For me, it became terribly uncomfortable, and I decided to leave. Listen, I said, you lie down and I'll go to the pharmacy. He didn't answer. I put on my coat and left his room. Crossing through the entrance hall, I looked closely into the coffin and at Melitina, reading over it. How I strained my eyes, but was unable to recognize in the dark yellow face of Zina, the feisty, pretty ingenue of Lukachev's troop. Sick transit, I thought. After that I left, not forgetting to take the revolver, and went to the pharmacy. But I should not have left. When I returned from the pharmacy, Vasiliev lay on the sofa in a faint. The bandages had been crudely torn off, and blood poured from the open wound. I couldn't bring him back to his senses until morning. He raved in a fever, shaking, and looked with insane eyes all around the room the entire time, until morning, when we heard the cry of the priest beginning to officiate the panakida. When Vasiliev's rooms filled with old women and torch-bearers, when the coffin was moved from its place and carried from the yard, I advised Vasiliev to stay home, but he wouldn't listen. Regardless of his pain or the dreary, rainy morning, in silence he followed the coffin all the way to the cemetery without wearing a hat, barely able to move his feet, periodically convulsing and clutching his wounded side. His face conveyed total apathy. Only once, when I drew him out of his stupor with some trivial question, did he cast his gaze over the pavement and the gray fence, and his eyes momentarily flashed with morose anger. "Wainwright. W-R-I-T-E, he read on a sign. Illiterate idiots. To hell with them all. I drove him home from the cemetery. It's been only a year since that night, and Vasiliev has not had time to wear out the boots in which he trudged through the mud behind his wife's coffin. Today, as I finish this story, he sits in my parlor and, playing the piano, shows the women how provincial young ladies sing sentimental songs. The ladies are laughing, and he himself is laughing. He's having a good time. I invite him into my study. Apparently unhappy with me depriving him of pleasurable company, he halts before me in the manner of a person who is pressed for time. I give him my story and ask him to read it. Always disdainful about my authorship, he suppresses a sigh, the sigh of a lazy reader. He sits in the armchair and begins to read. "Damn, what horrors," he mumbles, smiling. But the more engrossed he becomes in the story, the more serious becomes the expression on his face. Finishing, he begins to pace the room up and down. "How does it end?" I ask him. "How does it end? He casts his gaze around the room, at me, at himself. He looks at his new fashionable suit, hears the laughter of the women, and, falling into the armchair, begins to laugh as he laughed on that night. "Well, wasn't I right when I told you it was all funny? My God, I have carried so much on my shoulders, much more than an elephant could bear, suffered the devil knows what, suffered more than anyone. Where's the evidence? It's amazing. It would seem that the stamp made upon a man by his suffering would be eternal. So what? That stamp wears out as easily as a cheap shoe sole. Nothing is left, not even a wisp. It's as if I weren't suffering then, but were dancing a mazurka. Everything in the world is backwards. So backwards that it's funny. It's a wide field for humorists. Add on a humorous end, brother." "Pyotr Nikolaevich will be in soon," call the impatient women to my hero. "This minute," says the vain and childish man, straightening his tie. "It's funny, my brother. Pitiful, and funny. What can you do? Homo sum." But still, I praise Mother Nature for her change of things. If the excruciating memory of a toothache remained with us along with the horrors that each of us had to live through, if all that were eternal, living in this world would be a bad time for our fellow men. I look at his smiling face, and I recall the anguish and horror in his eyes 1 year ago when he gazed at the dark window. I see him stepping into his usual role of an erudite windbag, prepared to flaunt before me his useless theories on the nature of change, and at this time I remember him sitting on the floor in a pool of blood with sick, begging eyes. So, how to end it? I ask myself aloud. Vasiliev, whistling and straightening his tie, exits into the parlor, and I follow him with my eyes, and I'm annoyed. For some reason, I'm sorry for his past sufferings. I'm sorry for all that I felt for this man on that horrible evening, but similarly, I had lost something.
And now, Zina, a play by R. Andrew White, suggested by the short story, A Story Without an End, by Anton Chekhov, translated by R. Andrew White, with Jane Martsinovsky Hendricks. The characters are an injured man, played by James Serpento, and Peter, played by Michael Tallman, me. There's a single wooden chair in an otherwise empty room when...
Zina?
No,
Are you an angel?
I'm Peter.
You must be a saint, huh?
I'm your neighbor.
I do not quite recollect you at this moment.
There is no reason you should.
Well, Peter, is it... Welcome to my basement.
Thank you. Listen, I am going to...
Please, sit down, so I can see you.
I think it's a doctor you need to see. Now.
Don't.
I'm going to get a doctor.
Don't!
Listen, put the gun down.
If you leave...
No. Get that away from your...
I will be dead when you return.
Get that away from your head. You'll hurt yourself.
Well, you would not want that on your hands, would you?
No, I wouldn't.
So, please, pull up a chair.
I do not want you to die.
I want my wife back.
Zina is dead. You cannot have her back.
How do you know she's dead?
I knew her. We would see each other in our gardens. We would talk over the fence. I saw her buried.
She resembled a ghost when they put her in the ground. So pallid was her
Countenance.
Yes.
She was pale in life. A pale, beautiful...
Ghost.
Give me the gun. Let me get a doctor, my friend. Allow me
Peter,
to save you.
what led you here to my basement?
I was out in the garden, you see?
Garden.
Tending flowers.
Zina loved flowers.
White chrysanthemums.
Yes.
They were her favorite.
Mums.
And I heard your gun.
She was my flower.
I had to break your door in.
My flower.
With my hoe.
You're a good neighbor, eh?
Not if I let you die. Don't point that at your head. Listen to me. That would be the same
Peter?
as if I pulled the trigger. What?
Do you know why I'm doing this?
Zina.
Unrequited love, then. Is that how it appears?
No, it is only love. Or fear, perhaps.
Fear, yes.
Of life without her.
Of death without her. Love and fear. Eh? Well, that's what they write songs about, eh?
Put the gun down. That's better, isn't it? Let me Here, let me lift up your head.
You know, it's funny. No one understands the psychological subtleties of suicide.
What?
Oh, I'm not going to lecture. I just think it's funny. Funny thought at the moment of truth. No. God alone understands the soul of a man who takes his own life. Men? No, they don't. I think maybe I should have shot myself in the temple.
No.
The mouth, perhaps. Shot myself in the belly. I mean, Peter, this hurts.
Just have your own terrible moment. Just have your own terrible moment. Your earlobes are curling under.
Peter.
Yes?
I hope you won't think I'm putting you on the spot.
Shh.
I want to thank you, Peter. There was a man, another man.
Yes?
Took my Zina away from me.
Did she love him?
More than the world, she told me, in her little girl, childlike way.
That much?
And although she would never say his name, she
gave herself to him.
But I knew she still loved me. I told her it would pass, for she was so young, so innocent.
A child.
I wanted to protect her.
Yes.
So when I put the poison in her tea...
Poison?
I knew, you see, that I would take her back.
In her tea?
So thank you, my friend.
Oh, my...
I took her back.
Christ.
So finish me, Peter. I long to be in her arms.
Zina.
We will be with you, always.
No.
In your heart, Peter.
Oh my God.
Until the day of your death. So kill me, Peter, and we will be with you. With you. That's it. Take it. Yeah. It's nice. Feels nice in your hand, yeah? Heavy. Point it here. Point it at me. My head. That's perfect. We will be with you. With you. 10 years. 20. 100. Until you die. Zina and I. Zina and I. Until you die. Zina and I.
This has been Iowa Stage Theater Company's SCRIPTEASE audio drama, Love for Short. Short works of Anton Chekhov, newly translated and adapted by R. Andrew White and Iowa Stage Theater Company member James Serpento with Jane Martsinovsky Hendricks. You've been listening to A Story Without an End, End Zina, with Iowa Stage resident artists James Serpento and Michael Tallman. This has been a production of Iowa Stage Theater Company in association with Kingman Row Entertainment and Little Thief Audio. Sound effects provided by the users of freesound.org through the Creative Commons Public Domain dedication. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/iowastage to access our SCRIPTEASE audio drama catalog, featuring Chekhov's The Bear, The Proposal, and The Ninny. We hope you'll join us in the coming weeks for more Love for Short, as well as our upcoming digital production of The Agitators by Matt Smart, April 16th through the 25th. We also invite you to visit our website at iowastage.org to learn more about our season, and to be sure to visit our store, where you can purchase Love for Short in 2 different print collections. One containing the plays only, and also the special edition, which contains not only the plays, but the short stories on which those plays are based, as well as essays by the authors and a foreword by actress Kate Burton. Join us next time for Chekhov's The Doctor and the 2 short stories on which it is based. Until then, thank you so much for listening.